Why is it called dangerous love? Because that requires vulnerability. It requires us to do something that's scary. It requires us to do something that we're not sure whether it's going to be reciprocated back from the other person or not. But it is the thing that is going to change the dynamic in the relationship in a way that offers hope.
Welcome to a new episode of the Hope Strategy Podcast. I'm here with Josh, as always, and we just had a great conversation with Chad Ford. What do you think, Josh?
You know, I like all of our guests, but that might be my favorite one yet because I felt like there was so much depth and useful stuff. I wish we had 10 more hours to talk with
him. I know. We really may he might be one of our first return guests. We might have to reach out to him in a few months to recap all of this. Chad Ford has been living 5 lives simultaneously for nearly 20 years. He's been an international conflict mediator, a college professor, a senior consultant and facilitator for the Arbinger Institute, an executive board member for Peace Players, a writer, analyst, and entrepreneur covering the NBA and NBA draft for ESPN. While most people know him for his work at ESPN, being a basketball analyst and writer was actually his side gig from the last 2 decades. Chad's peace-building work is what defines him. After completing a master's degree in conflict analysis and resolution from George Mason University and a Juris Doctorate from Georgetown University Law School in 2000, Chad was poised to begin his career as a conflict mediator and facilitator. However, and we didn't even talk about this, which I want to get to, but Chad sold a small internet startup, sportstalk.com, that he co-founded while in graduate school to ESPN right after he graduated and spent the next 4 years working full-time with ESPN as a senior editor and writer covering the NBA and NBA draft. The experience covering NBA games was a lifelong dream, but Chad yearned to do something more impactful with his conflict resolution skills. In 2005, he left his full-time work with ESPN to become the director of the David O. McKay Center for Intercultural Understanding at BYU Hawaii. That bio right there is one of the cooler ones, right, that we've had. I remember learning about Chad initially through BYU Hawaii, because if you've listened to the podcast, you know that I have connections there. In fact, I studied what he taught at BYU Hawaii. And then I heard that he was an ESPN analyst. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And it's like, no, he writes for ESPN. He's like the guy for the NBA draft. Anyways, fascinating background, fascinating story. And I think we covered a lot of bases with that, but there's still so much more, like I said, to get to. Again, it's November 11th. It's Veterans Day. That was incredibly timely. You'll hear about that right out the gate in the podcast. But then also, he has been in the Middle East. He's been in South Africa. He's been in Northern Ireland. He's traveled the world as a mediator and a peace builder, working with governments and individuals, both on a small and a very, very large, important scale, to help navigate tense situations to find peace. That's his whole thing, right? And again, in the US here, many people that listen aren't in the US, but here in the US with the election that just happened and the bitter divides that we're seeing, not just between people from different political ends of the spectrum, but really probably way more importantly and critically, family members, friends, these divides that are happening. And so to talk to him and ask him very specifically how we can put things into practice based off of all of the knowledge that he has, any tips or guidance that he has in order to navigate the world we live in right now, effectively listen to this podcast and take notes and implement what he talked about, and then go and read his book, Dangerous Love. The website is dangerouslovebook.com. But yeah, like I said, I don't think there's ever been a more timely conversation that we've had. And I'm with you. That was fantastic.
It was a great one. Hope you all enjoy it.
Yeah. We'll leave it at that. Listen and enjoy this conversation with Chad Ford.
Something is happening in our world.
Time is very precious.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
Hope in the face of difficulty.
More than machinery, we need humanity.
Hope in the face of uncertainty.
I'm better now than I was. I'm experienced now. Okay.
Changing the world can happen anywhere, and anyone can do it.
The audacity of hope.
This is the Hope Strategy Podcast with Corey Blake and Josh Steinley. I feel like your life's work to this point, which, I mean, your bio is accurate where it says you've been living 5 different lives simultaneously for the last 20 years. It's shocking to me. Like when I read about everything that you've accomplished, there's a lot that we can dive into. I think the first thing we always like to understand in order to understand where people are now is where they're coming from and get a little context. So would you mind tell us, you grew up in Kansas City, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So what was life like for you growing up? What was your childhood like?
Yeah, my childhood was really challenging for a couple of reasons. My father was drafted into the Vietnam War when I was young. And when he came back, he started experiencing a lot of neurological symptoms, some that were really consistent with PTSD. So, I would wake up in the night and my dad would be hiding behind the couch with his M16, thinking the Viet Cong were in the living room. And some of it began to affect his speech and his balance and what have you. When I was about, 7 or 8, he was diagnosed with degeneration of your cerebellum in the back of your brain, which affects your fine motor coordination, balance, speech and what have you. It's extremely rare disease. There's no cure or treatment for it. My father at that point had a bit of a freak out, I guess is probably the best way. I was pretty young. So, I don't remember all of it, but he left just in the middle of the night and I didn't see him again for years. And, it left my family in a really, really difficult position. We weren't particularly wealthy to begin with. My mom, just with a high school education, things got really rough, for a really long time. In addition to that, and I think this is not a negative, this was a positive. I grew up in a part of Kansas that was multiracial. And at the time, there was a lot of racial tensions in the community, but I got exposed at a young age to that, but also to making a lot of multiracial friends and connections there. And, between all of that, by the time I rolled into college and decided that that's what I wanted to do, at first I wouldn't want to be a filmmaker, and that didn't end up, panning out because I became really interested just in conflict, in social movements. I bounced around a little bit into what to study. So I started in history and then political science and then Hawaiian history as I went on to BYU Hawaii. And, through all of this, I just noticed that I kept gravitating to why are we divided? What are the causes of that? What are the causes of war sort of historically? I think a lot of it was deeply generated by, my own life experience sort of growing up. And I was a student at BYU Hawaii, which has a very unique university, with, students from, over 100 countries, 3,000 students. And I noticed that there was tension there, but there was also a lot of harmony there. And, when you started to understand the founding of the school and that the intention was to bring all these people together to try to find a way to sort of live together and work together, it just really rested upon me, probably my senior year of college. This is what I want to do. I want to figure out how to help, people come together. I didn't know how to do that. I talked to a lot of people. I said I was going to go to law there are a lot of jokes probably there because, why, lawyers cause problems. They don't solve problems. But it was a huge part of the journey for me because when I got there, I started to learn about mediation and alternative dispute resolution and diplomacy and, all of these different things. And, from there, I really started to focus my career.
So one of the questions I was going to ask you, the second question that I had jotted down were there any specific motivations or reasons from your childhood why you decided to study conflict resolution? I had no idea. I just thought, this is an interesting thing to go all in on the way that you have. A lot of people study something because it's convenient or because they don't know what else to study. But when you get a bachelor's in history and then you go on to get a master's in conflict resolution and then you go on to get a law degree, and then you bring that all together to do what you've done. I had a feeling there might be something more there. So, and I guess it's timely. It's Veterans Day today. So,
and the interesting thing, Corey, is that a lot of that was subconscious. A lot of that I'm unpacking in graduate school. Why am I here? It wasn't conscious, at the time. It took quite a while for me to sort of realize what that was about and why I was making the decisions that I had. And so, I wish I could say, it was all very clearly laid out. I vowed as a high school senior that this was what I was going to do. It took a long time to get the motivations clear.
That's how it goes though. I mean, I think for everybody, you get, later in life and you start to look back and say, oh my goodness, I had no idea the way that these dots were connecting. But now that like you said, unpacking a lot of this, it's starting to really come together and make sense. When your dad left and you said that you didn't see him for many years down the road, I mean, did you eventually have a moment where you guys came back together? And I mean,
I did. My dad did eventually return and the disease continued to take its toll. By the time I was in, high school, he was in a wheelchair and wasn't really able to walk. My parents divorced as part of it. So he was living with his mother, my grandmother, for a while. But, the relationship really, reconnected. And, I was really close with my father and, obviously felt for him. Yeah. And the life experience that he was going through, especially tough to have a disease where most doctors have never even seen it before in their life. That there's so few people that have it, that there's not any real research or progress being made or hope down the road. And because it's a neurological disease too, you don't really know what part of your life is going to get taken next. As your cerebellum degenerates, different functions that the cerebellum controls, you just lose kind of almost like randomly overnight. He would lose something. He passed away in 2005. The last, probably 10 years of his life, especially the quality of life for him was really, really poor. And I talk about this a little bit in my book, but my dad and I had one huge conflict left for us, right towards the end. And it probably taught me more about conflict resolution than anything I'd studied and any mediation that I'd ever done in the Middle East or anywhere else, this one that I had with my father.
And we're going to talk a lot about this, all of the different areas of expertise and experiences that you've had as you've, built this career and really made a huge difference in a lot of different ways in conflict resolution specifically. But it's interesting the role that empathy can play in conflict resolution specifically, right? And understanding somebody and truly, we talk a lot about seeking first to understand and then to be understood, right? One of the 7 habits, like that idea of like, if you can really truly understand somebody, not just on the surface, but really try to dive deep and get 2 or 3 or 4 layers deep with somebody and understand and have empathy for the trials that they're facing, the difficulties in front of them, their past experiences, whatever, it gives you a completely different perspective and allows you to help in ways that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise. So as you've gone to the Middle East, I think over 50 times, right? And you've worked specifically with some very significant world conflicts and as a mediator and as a consultant and things. And I don't want to keep hitting on this too hard, but having grown up with a father who was a veteran, a Vietnam veteran, who was the rest of his life was plagued by war, by the fact that he went to Vietnam and fought, and it affected him so severely. I mean, again, and a lot of this is probably hindsight, right? As you've unpacked it, but what type of empathy has that given for you and motivation to, in whatever small way you can, impact others to overcome conflict in a better way?
I don't think that part hit me until I had my first child. And I started to think about, how my father was there and then wasn't there. And a lot of it wasn't his fault, and how I wanted to be there and what I wanted for my children. And part of it was that, I wanted a world where they were never called into that sort of service, that they never had to do that. I have deep, deep respect, though I am someone who promotes and believes in nonviolence and someone who actively tries to pursue conflict resolution in a nonviolent way. I have a deep respect for what our military does and the veterans there. My father ended up in a veteran hospital for the last, 10 years or so of his life, and, going and visiting him, but also all the veterans that were there and seeing the very real costs of war. We glorify it in a way that is obscene to me, because the people that typically glorify it are the people that haven't experienced it or haven't experienced the ramifications of it. That's a trend that I see, all the time. And having worked not only, in the US, but with a lot of in war-torn communities, to see the impact that it has on women and children, the impact that it has on the economies of people, the impact that it has on health and mental health. And it's devastating. There are no winners in war.
Yeah.
And by the way, the wars that are happening on large scale are happening in small scales in our homes and in our communities all the time. And while they might not leave the physical damage that, large scale war does, the mental, emotional damage that they leave is just as devastating, for people. And so, part of what came out of all of this for me was that if there's anything that I could do to help alleviate that, if there was anything I could do to provide an alternative way, right, to deal with our problems, that's what I wanted to be dedicated to and doing. And, your podcast is about hope. And when I wrote Dangerous Love, a big part of that was that my experience as a mediator in all sorts of conflicts, whether it's family conflict or out in the world, is that people lack hope that there's any other way, right? That conflict just has to be destructive. That's what's going to happen. And so we run from it, or we, put on our armor and we go to war to try to get what we want. And there's other alternatives to conflict that aren't avoiding it, but aren't wreaking destruction in families and communities that can actually lead us to a better place. I'm no longer afraid of conflict. I actually think conflict can actually be constructive. I actually think it can actually improve our relationships and improve our communities and workplaces if we have the tools and know how to engage in it. And so, part of what I feel like my job is to give people hope that you can do this, that there are ways forward. And there's this writer I like, his name is John Paul Lederach, and he's a longtime conflict mediator. And he talks about the moral imagination. And he says, look, violence is a failure of the moral imagination. It's when I'm in a conflict, I can't figure out how to solve it. I can't think of any other way. And so I'm just going to force the person, right? Whatever that takes, run them over, knock them out, beat them up, use my power over them to get what I want. And how do you ignite that moral imagination to think about alternative ways of both getting what we need, but at the same time caring for the people that we're in this life with? And so, you talk about that seek first to understand before you understood. That's at the heart of this book. The Arbinger Institute and the influence that they've had on me as well is that, we are able to work through conflict constructively when we see people as people, and we're not when we see people as objects. Yeah,
that's awesome. Again, I didn't anticipate having this, but I guess since it is Veterans Day, we'll say shout out to all the veterans, anybody that is listening. My dad, I texted him first thing this morning. My dad served 22 years in the Air Force. I grew up a military kid, and I was just talking to him, just going back to the impacts that some of that has. I was talking to him a few weeks ago. I was at his house visiting him, and he never was in like an active war, right? He served in Somalia and Kosovo and Egypt, and he was on deployments of these different places, but he was a computer guy. So he wasn't out on the front lines fighting or anything. But I was talking to him, and in the small town that he lives in lives the guy that was the doctor for SEAL Team 6. And he said that he went up and spoke with him, and this guy was explaining to him that he couldn't even leave the house because he was just so fearful. Like he just couldn't do anything without being taken back. And my dad, he started crying as he was speaking with me, and he said, I have a hard time doing anything either. And this is my dad who just saw things, but never was on the front lines actively, doing the terrible things that you have to do in war, right? The impacts that they have, and I'm with you, man, the way that it's glorified and the way that it's portrayed is so damaging. Anyways, we don't need to go down that rabbit hole for too long, but just a shout out to all the veterans out there. The Arbinger Institute, we're going to jump way ahead real quick because I'm in the process of reading The Anatomy of Peace. So I've watched a bunch of stuff about it. I'm in the process of reading it right now. I watched an interview that you did with the Arbinger Institute, and you were talking about how, I think it's when you were in school, or maybe you were in the middle of some mediation somewhere, I can't remember, but you read The Anatomy of Peace, and you said that it completely changed your perspective, and and it really changed the way that you saw conflict resolution, even though you at that point were an expert, right? We're always trying to become more and more expert at whatever it is that we're doing. What impact did that have on you specifically? And why did you decide to get involved with the Arbinger Institute for so long?
Yeah, I was my very first year teaching at the university, and I had a student who was an older student who had encountered Arbinger's work at an organization called Anasazi, which is out in the Arizona desert. It's actually sort of what the book Anatomy of Peace is based off of.
Yeah.
Drug rehab, other issues for young people. And they go out and they essentially walk in the desert and have to figure out how to find food and all of these different things. And as part of that, the parents that are having their kids there go through a workshop. And one of the takeaways is it's not just that my kid is messed up. It's all these sort of interactions. And Anatomy of Peace really sort of mirrors that as a story. And it mirrors the sort of parents going in the room and learning something about this. And so she had that experience as a parent. And so she's seen in my peace building classes, and she's like, hey, these are really good. And I really appreciate all that, you're teaching me, but I think you're missing like this huge point out of all of this. And, I'll be honest, I was like offended. I was like, okay, you're in my 101 class. I've been studying this for all the time. I mean, you're really just going to come in here and tell me. And she handed me a pre-publication version of Anatomy of Peace. It wasn't actually out yet, but she'd gotten it from someone at Arbinger, and she said, I just really think you need to read this book. It's going to change your life. And I said, thank you very much. And it sat on my desk for a while. And then I was going to go do a mediation in the Middle East that was, quite a tense and scary one. And she came back in. And she, again, this time with like tears in her eyes, like, you have got to read this book. It's going to save your life. I couldn't get her to stop crying. So I'm like, okay, I'll read it. I'll put it in my bag. I promise I'll read it. And then I don't. Like, I put it in my bag. It's a really long flight from Hawaii to Israel. And I didn't read it, but I had an experience in the mediation that blew my mind. And I didn't understand it. A negotiation that was going terribly turned on a dime. And all of a sudden it went super successful. And as I went home and I'm like laying in the bed, like I'm feeling really good that the mediation turned out to be a success, but I also couldn't quite connect the dots in my head about why. And it was really bothering me. And so a much more humbled Chad on the flight home picks up Anatomy of Peace. And about halfway through the book, like I have like one of those like life changing, she was right. Like light bulbs go on in my head. And here's what it was. As a mediator, I always saw myself as the solution to the problem, never the problem. The people that have the conflict, they're the problem. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I walked into this session seeing this person that I was negotiating with as the problem. And I had lots of justification for why they were. And I'm here to fix the problem. And what occurred to me as I was reading the book is, what changed in that negotiation was there was a moment when it clicked to me that I wasn't seeing him as a person. And when I saw him as a person, everything about our interaction started to change in really powerful ways. And so my takeaway on the flight home was the person in the room that needed to change was me. And when I changed, everything else in the room changed. And it just had not occurred to me before. I mean, I'm a peace builder. I'm a conflict mediator. I'm a really good guy. Like, I'm not the guy who starts conflicts. I'm the guy who goes and solves them. And it opened up this entire world for me, Corey. I mean, I started to look at not just my work, but my relationships at home and in my life. And I'm like, what if I approached it from this standpoint, right? Instead of just blaming other people and saying that I'm having these conflicts with others because of them, what if I looked at the ways that I'm seeing them and the ways that I might be contributing to conflict? And that's what the Arbinger work is so helpful to me. It's overcoming this problem of self-deception and overcoming this issue around the fact that when I see someone as an object, I see them falsely. And because I see them falsely, I no longer can see my role in the conflict anymore. And so I'm actually like pouring gasoline on a fire, but I think I'm pouring water. Mm-hmm. Right? Like I tell myself I'm pouring water to put this fire out, but I'm actually pouring gasoline on it. And then when the flames get higher and higher and higher, I'm blaming them for the flames getting higher, but I'm the one pouring the gasoline on. Right. And having that shift of mindset for me, not only did it change a lot of personal relationships, which probably was the most important thing that happened, but it started to change the way that I started thinking about the work that I was doing as a mediator, both in how I interacted with the people that I was trying to help, but also how I helped them change the way that they saw each other as a way of transforming the conflict.
I want to get into the weeds on that just a little bit. And again, we'll talk higher level here in a second as well, but okay, so you're in this, and big shout out to I miss the roosters in the background of all of my Zoom meetings when I lived in Hawaii. I don't get the roosters anymore. I love hearing the roosters. So you're in this moment, and you have this paradigm shift in that moment, right? Of saying, "Oh my gosh, I need to look at this person as a person." Right now, I'm seeing them as all of the things I studied in my textbooks and all of the things I've listened to and researched and whatever, all the notes I've taken. I'm looking at them as, how do I solve this puzzle versus how do I help this person? What are some of those tidbits? And again, you can learn all about this in the book. I'm in Dangerous Love. I'm sure you go into a lot more detail on all of this stuff. So go listen to that or read that. What are some of those specific tools that you use? Again, in a business partnership between me and Josh, right? Or in a personal relationship between spouses or partners or whatever it might be. What are some of those tools that you employ before you even walk into the room or sit down on the meeting or whatever, in order to get to that place where you're able to see people as individuals, as human beings with goals and ambitions and things, and trying to solve those problems as a team, I guess?
I think part of it is that we have to turn off our fear brain. And, I talk a lot about this in the book, but what I've seen as a mediator And it's so helpful because it illuminates my own life, by the way. Helping other people often is an illumination on your own life, right? And when you see other people going through it, sometimes it's easier to kind of see it, even in yourself. Most of us grow up with a just generalized fear of conflict. And so if you think about a particular definition of conflict, this is one I use in the book. I'm not saying it's the only one, but I think it's helpful, is our inability to collaboratively problem solve. Right. And whether you're working with a family or an organization or whatever, when we have a problem and we can't figure out how to solve it together, conflict erupts. Right. And for many of us, just that evokes a pretty strong fear response within us. And when that response is evoked, some predictable things start happening to human beings, right?
And is that just societal? Is that just cultural? Like,
some of it's genetic. To be honest, I mean, if you start to thinking about sort of developmental psychology,
it's a survival mechanism,
right? Yeah. It's the fight or flight instinct that human beings have. But, in a modern society, it's not that I'm being chased by a lion, right? That doesn't, we don't really have that experience very often, but all sorts of emotional distress or psychological distress can provoke a very similar response. And so what do we do when we have that response? And there's really interesting brain scans that actually sort of show what happens to the human brain at that moment, right? It's like we get blinders on and we start to calculate our options. Can I run away? Right? Can I run away from this? Right? That's the flight sort of instinct. And it's the most common instinct for most people. If I can just avoid this conflict or get away from it, that's what I'm going to do. If I can outrun the lion, I'm going to outrun the lion, right? Mm-hmm. If I can't, now I have to stand my ground, pick up a weapon, and I got to fight. Right? It's come to eat me, so I got to fight. Right? And that's the other way to survive. Or, for some of us, some threats, I call this accommodation. We lie down and play dead. Right. We just sort of give in. We're quickly submissive and hope that because we're submissive, the person will be happy. The conflict will subside and it'll go away. And because of that, we do basically everything wrong. Right? When conflict should be about, in that moment, asking questions, becoming curious about the other person, trying to understand the role that I play versus they play, rolling up our sleeves and saying, I need to know what you need. Here's what I need. And we're going to work together to find a solution that works for both of us. We're doing all that other stuff, all of it, which is completely unhelpful. Right? So if we run away, then the conflict doesn't disappear. Right? We just get it out of our mindset and it keeps kind of erupting. It keeps kind of coming back to us. And then we get frustrated and we get fatigued. If we sort of fight and we lose, then, that has all sorts of negative consequences. If we win, we might feel good in the moment. Yeah. But the other person doesn't. Right? Or the other group doesn't. And the seeds of the next conflict are already sown. And now I'm in this sort of constant battle that's going forward. And if I just lay down and play dead, now that's the strategy I'm probably going to have to employ over and over and over again. And eventually I'm going to get exhausted and I'm going to get frustrated and I'm going to start to feel a lot of resentment and I'm just going to explode. And so all of the instincts that we feel as people when conflict comes are counterproductive, right? They're actually asking us to do things that are either going to prolong the conflict or make it worse or make it spread. And then when that happens, we become hopeless because we feel like, man, there's nothing I can do about this. I mean, I can't tell you how often when the people come in and talk to me, what they're saying is, I've tried everything. Nothing works. This is impossible. And I'm done. And the problem is I've tried all the things that don't work and then they didn't work. And I don't understand what doesn't work. And so I know that sounds like a funny first step, but it is the first step to sort of recognize that the things that I'm doing aren't actually helpful, right? Running is not going to solve your conflict. Fighting is not going to solve your conflict. Laying down and giving in is not going to solve your conflict. And I have to let go of those tools to be able to actually sit down, calm down. And this is the other thing, because it's hard for me to see you as a person if I'm feeling huge threats from you in the moment. If I'm feeling like you're going to hurt me, it's really hard for me to do that. And I have to open up space that just because we're in conflict with each other doesn't make you a bad guy. Doesn't mean that you're trying to hurt me. Doesn't mean that you're trying to ruin my life. And now I've got to get deeply curious. And that's the other big step. Can I get curious about the other person and what their needs, wants, and desires are, what it is that they're looking for in this conflict, instead of the hyper focus on myself, because I know what I want and need. But now can I put that aside? I'm not getting rid of it, but like kind of set it aside for a minute and get deeply focused on another person.
So is it fair to say that the number one cause for not resolving conflict and ongoing conflict, is it ego? If you're unable to put yourself aside and look at the other person and truly understand, I mean, that's probably way bigger than that. But is that a fair assessment?
And ego and fear are combined, because I always say fear, but ego's connected to that, because one of my biggest fears is that I'm wrong. Mm-hmm. Right. And the need to be right is such a huge need in conflict that I will bend myself into pretzels to be right. Yeah. And so the fear is that I was wrong. I was wrong about this person. The thing that I did or said was wrong. And I don't want to be wrong. When I tell people that, they always come back with this, but what if I'm right? Because I really think I'm right. Right. Which of course in conflict, we are going to feel like we're right. Yeah. And, my response to that is, there's a way to be right on the facts, but to be deeply wrong in the relationship. And which is more important to you?
One thing that I've seen, and again, this is mainly in probably managing people, like on our team, right? As we've built a business, and I studied international culture studies. Like, it's kind of like what you said, unpacking later. Like, I just so happen to run an international business with a team in Hong Kong that we've built in these different places. And I love it. I mean, it all came together nicely, because people are like, wait, why are you an entrepreneur and you started this business, but you studied ICS, whatever. But one thing that I've seen in managing teams and people and building a company is that a lot of times the assumption with ego, going back to this ego, the assumption with ego is that ego means that you're cocky, that you're arrogant, and let's see if I can say this right. So that when the only time ego is the problem is when somebody's coming in arrogantly or cocky or smug or whatever. But the fact is a lot of times people's ego gets in the way, even when they're being submissive or fearful or something, the opposite of those things, just because they're not able to put their self to the side and look at this. We're focusing on the greater good, not me versus you. I don't know if I'm explaining this right, but a lot of times it's just assumed that ego, the connotation is like arrogant, cocky, bold, whatever. But a lot of times ego can get in the way when you're the other person as well, and you're unable to just put your personality or your personal desires to the side in order to communicate for the greater good. Does that make sense?
Yeah, look, ego is all about self-preservation. It will look different in different people, but what it will have at its core is self-preservation, right? Great collaboration and great conflict transformation is all about us preservation. And that distinction is a really important one, because in conflict, I have to not let go of my own needs because they're important, but I have to balance them out. I have to equate them with the needs of others. And so what happens mostly in conflict is people err on one side or the other. It's either all about me, and I could care less about how this impacts anybody else, or I'm one of those people that I care deeply about how it impacts everybody else, but I don't understand what I need or want out of the relationship. And so I'm essentially the martyr in the organization or in the relationship that always lays down the sacrifice for everybody else. And that's not us preservation either. That's them preservation.
It's that type of preservation that you would think, or it's easy to assume, is not based in ego, because it's like, well, no, I'm doing this for everybody else. It's like, no, but the problem is you're not able to recognize that because of ego, right?
And it's this too. What's behind that? When I'm doing it for everybody else and I'm not able to bring my own needs into it, it's the need to be loved, right? Because I'm operating under an assumption that people will love me if I give them everything that they want, and that my needs are dangerous to the relationship now. Right. And so, but what I really want out of that, it's still egocentric, is I want people to love. I want people to acknowledge that I'm the person that always sacrifices first. I want people to point out how great I am and how easy I am to work with and how I always put other people first. And that still is about me.
You mentioned needing to have a deep curiosity, Chad, about the other person that you're talking to when you're in a conflict, which to me, this reminds me of what I read about in Leadership and Self-Deception about being in the box and out of the box. And I have a question about that. But before we talk about that, for people who may have not read the book and aren't familiar with that terminology, can you explain briefly what in the box versus out of the box means?
Yeah. So in the book, Leadership and Self-Deception, and Arbinger's second book, Anatomy of Peace, they essentially equate being in the box or out of the box with seeing someone as a person or seeing someone as an object. When I see someone as a person, I'm out of the box. When I see someone as an object, I'm in. And there's different ways that you can see someone as an object. It can be like a vehicle to me. In other words, I'm actually outwardly nice to them because they're useful to me. But the minute that they're not useful to me, I could care less about you anymore. Or they're an obstacle. They're in my way in some way. Or they're irrelevant. They neither help me nor hurt me. So therefore they're irrelevant to my life. And it's a metaphor. I've heard different people from Arbinger explain it different ways, but to me, the way I've always liked to think about it is like, if I were to literally sort of think about being in a refrigerator box, because I'm a pretty tall guy, right? Like if I'm in that box, I can't actually see the humanity of other people. I really can only see myself inside that box, but I feel trapped and I feel like I can't really move. And it's actually something that's actually quite stifling. And when we're in the box, that's a very sort of common emotion that we feel. And part of it is the sense that conflict is something that happens to me, not something that I participate in, right? And so when I'm in the box, it's because of your thoughts, your actions, what you did, what you said, and how it's impacting me. And I can't see it any further than that. I can't see how I'm impacting other people, or I don't take any responsibility for my emotions, any responsibility for how I react or my actions or behavior anymore. It's all externally dependent on someone else. And so when I'm in the box, what I'm going to do is I'm going to blame, I'm going to horribilize, other people, if that's a word. I'm going to focus on how I'm right and you're wrong. I'm going to always be taking values and I'm a value driven person and you lack those values. I'm going to be creating this story, this narrative that makes me out to be great and the other people to be the problem. And therefore I don't have to deal with the problem because the problem isn't me. And when I work with a lot of organizations, this is the most common way. How do you know organization is in the box? The organization's dysfunctional. They're losing money. There's major problems. And when you go interview people office to office, everybody locates the problem outside their office. Every single person says, yep, there's a huge problem in this organization. It just doesn't happen to be here. We're killing it. We're crushing it. Right. My team or my group is, but over there, that group there. And of course, then you get done and everyone's pointed the finger at each other. That's like typical, like in the box.
So in the box is bad. Out of the box is good. And the problem is, it's when there's a moment of conflict, that's when you need to be out of the box the most so that you can see people as people rather than objects. But of course, when you're in a state of conflict, you're in the box because you're emotional.
Most likely in, yeah.
How do you move from being in the box to out of the box? Because I read the book and I've been trying to figure this out for 20 years and I get in that emotional state, whether it's with my wife or somebody I'm arguing with on social media. And in that moment, there's even that tickle in the back of my mind that says, you're in the box. You need to get out of the box. Bad things happen when you're in the box and I can't do it. And then an hour later, a day later, I'm like, why did I say that stupid stuff? Like, I know I'm not supposed to do this. It's like, where's that tool that allows me to move from that emotional state of seeing people as objects and stop it and say, wait a second, in the box, and then move? How do you do that?
One, you already talked about maybe the most important step. I have to recognize I'm there in the first place, right? If I don't recognize that I'm there, I'm not going to make a move out, right? And so understanding, and I think this is where Arbinger's language is especially helpful, and their books helping you understand that you're in the box, right? I mean, it's not necessarily a great feeling when you get done reading Leadership and Self-Deception or Anatomy of Peace. It's sort of like, I'm an idiot is kind of, the big takeaway, from the book. But that's actually really important in a certain way because it's alerting us. It's like a smoke alarm that's going off in our brain that's saying there's a fire here that you have been not alive to for a really long time. And it's here. And unless I'm alive to it, I can't put out the fire because I don't know where I think the fire exists elsewhere instead of me. And so that's the first step, actually. Then after that, what I really need to do is I need to start thinking about, okay, one of the things I know that I do in the box is I create justifications for why I'm right and they're wrong. And I start telling that story to myself. And so I have to start asking myself, What parts of this story might I be wrong about? What sorts of things might I not understand? In what ways am I not being curious? We talked about this, about the other person and what's going on in their life that might explain their behavior or their actions in a way that I haven't seen before. In what ways might I be contributing, verbally, non-verbally, whatever, to their reaction to things? And I have to start asking myself a bunch of questions that I don't typically ask myself in the box, that I don't typically ask myself in conflict. Right. And so much about it is about what's my impact on them and what's going on in their internal world in ways that I might not understand. And what's so interesting about when we're in conflict is that we become mind readers. It's amazing, right? We know somebody said something. I know what they meant. I know what their intention was. I know why they said it. I know everything, right? Even though they didn't say any of that. And I ask this all the time as mediators. So they actually said that to you. Well, no, they didn't say it. I mean, of course they wouldn't say it, but I know. Trust me, I know. And I think it's having that humility to say, do I know? Is that the truth really about them? Also, am I giving myself a pass here? Are there things that I'm doing or saying or contributing as well that might be part of that? And so, one of the tools, I guess, that I use is the minute that I feel that justifying voice in my head that says, oh, you know what that was about? Or did you see that them roll their eyes right there? Or did you see the way that they were looking at you? Or did you see how long it took them to return that email, that text or whatever? Or did you see that they didn't CC you on that? Or, whatever it is, that instead of just filling in the blanks and saying, I know what's going on there, I instead say, I don't know. I don't know what's going on there. And I should probably find out. But if I'm afraid of conflict, I'm never going to do it, right? It's so much easier just to jump to that assumptive world and get there. But if I'm not afraid of conflict, most of the time I'm going to find out. And this is the thing that I think is tough for people. It's complicated is what I'm going to find out. They may be in the box with me. Right. But that's not a reason for me to get back in the box with them. Or it may be something completely innocent. There's something totally else going on in their world. And that's what's going on. Either way. And this is something in the book. The most important thing, the most important move that I'm going to make is that I've got to be the one to turn first. If they're in the box with me, if they're seeing me as an object and I'm seeing them as an object, I can't wait around for them to start seeing me as a person. I'll wait forever. And you hear this all the time in conflict. Well, I'll change when they change. I'll do it when they do this thing first. I'll trust them when they prove to me that they're trustworthy. And, my response is they're thinking and saying the same thing. And then those people say, well, that's not fair because they started it or it was their first, or they did the worst thing, or, you'll hear all of this. Okay, that might be true. But what do you want? Do you want to be right or do you want to have peace? And if you want to be right, I can sit around blaming people for the rest of my life and know that I'm right and know that they started it or know that whatever they did was first or that they should have been the one that turned first or they should have gotten out of the box with me. Or I can just get out of the box. I can ask those questions. I can turn towards them and try to create the space for them to come. And that's the most dangerous move, right? Why is it called dangerous love? Because that requires vulnerability. It requires us to do something that's scary. It requires us to do something that we're not sure whether it's going to be reciprocated back from the other person or not. But it is the thing that is going to change the dynamic in the relationship in a way that offers hope.
As you were talking, the thought that came to me is vulnerability, right? The reason that that's so scary. And I love the name Dangerous Love of the book because the connotation with dangerous is maybe harmful or it can cause harm to somebody or, like the danger of jumping off of something, whatever. But what I like, and correct me if I'm wrong, you kind of just said it, so I don't think I am, but the idea with this notion of dangerous love, being able to see somebody as the individual and trying to understand their goals and ambitions and getting to a place where you can solve problems together requires you to say, I don't know. And that requires a level of vulnerability that most people just aren't comfortable with because you want to know, especially if it's in a professional setting, if it's in a relationship where you've invested so much time, energy, resources, whatever. It's really scary and dangerous to say, I don't know, and to put yourself in that place of vulnerability. But until you get to that place where you can accept that and be vulnerable, conflict will not be resolved. Problems will not be solved. And there's going to be continued issues, right?
And this is why I like talking to entrepreneurs, because I think there's an easy connection here, right? Not everybody has the stomach to be an entrepreneur. Why? Because you're starting your own thing And the safety net isn't there in ways that it is in traditional jobs. And while the potential for success is very high, there's also the potential for failure is also very high, right? There's lots of startups and lots of organizations, and even some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the world can talk about their failed business ventures, right? And things that didn't work out, or products that didn't work out, or what have you. And what makes a great entrepreneur, in my opinion, is that they're willing to take a risk. They're not afraid to fail. And if they do fail, they don't give up. They go back and learn from their mistakes and they try again. And lots of people don't have the stomach for that in business, right? And so they're never going to be entrepreneurs because, the risks involved in being an entrepreneur, they're just really, really hard to stomach. I think the same thing holds true in conflict in human relationships, right? To have deep, meaningful, connected relationships require us to be vulnerable, require us to take risk, require us to often fail at times in our relationships and make mistakes. And instead of, beating ourselves up and just giving up, picking ourselves back up and trying again, it means that often things are going to be lean for a while, that I'm not going to get instantaneous rewards or returns on my investment. Also, having grown up and starting my own company that I sold to ESPN, those first couple of years were pretty tough. They were really lean. And, there was so many days that I was asking myself, is this going to pay off in the end? Because it's not paying off in the short term. And then it did, it ultimately did pay off for us. But when we apply that to relationships, we're so quick to give up and throw our arms in the air and instead of staying in it and being intentional and saying, Josh and I, we just spent 5 hours trying to solve this problem and we didn't solve it. So screw it. I'm just going to go do my own thing, or, this is unsolvable, and walk away. But to get up the next morning and say, we're back in the meeting room again, Josh, and we're going to roll up our sleeves and we're going to do this again. And we're going to keep doing it until we get it right. And one of the interesting things is when I make that commitment, it actually speeds up the process. But when I don't make that sort of commitment, it actually slows it down, because at any moment I'm sort of hedging my bet, and one foot's in and one foot's out. And I'm always thinking about alternative options instead of just sticking in it. And so there's a real parallel to me to what makes a successful entrepreneur and what makes a successful collaborator or someone in conflict. And it's that same sort of tolerance that we have for risk. And so how do we get rid of it? Again, we have to let go of our fear, and we have to trust the process. Eventually people are going to turn. Eventually there are solutions to the problems that we have. And when we get there, they're going to be so powerful for us and so sustainable that we'll wonder, why would I have ever gone about it any other way?
Trusting that process and having that patience is tough, right? Especially when the heat is on and when there is emotions involved. Shifting gears a little bit, not really, but just making it more relevant to today, right now, what's happening in the world today, right? I watched your TEDx talk, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the stat that you used at that time, which I believe they did that, because I almost did that in was it February or early this year, right?
Yeah, it was in February. Yeah.
Okay. One of the statistics that you shared at that point, this is February. The world is not the same place that it was in February in so many ways. I mean, who would have thought, right? But one of the things that you said as it pertained to politics was that 1 in 6 individuals claimed that a relationship had been altered or messed up or shut down or whatever as a result of political beliefs. That number, I'm willing to guess, has doubled, tripled, quadrupled maybe at this point. One of the things that I'm seeing, and where I want all of this information and all of your knowledge to really bless the lives of people that listen to this podcast right now, I hope, and let's get this message out there the best that we can, leveraging your expertise in this moment. Because one of the biggest things that I'm seeing on social media now is, you can delete me or unfriend me if you don't want to talk, or if you don't believe what I believe or whatever, or posts that are just basically saying my way or the highway. If you believe in this guy or this person or this girl or whatever, you're a terrible person. You don't belong here. I don't want anything to do with you. I'll destroy years of friendship or familial ties because of this, right? That is the world that we live in right now on November 11th, 2020, when there's a political election that just took place. Talk about conflict, right? So how do we solve this problem? How do people seek to find solutions without burning bridges and destroying relationships, all for something that at the end of the day, they have very little control over, and it's just not worth it objectively, right? You can say that. What is your take on this?
Yeah, I just did a follow-up. I just wrote on the Dangerous Love. I have a website, dangerouslovebook.com. And I just wrote a article about how to talk to family about politics. And I wrote it in part because of, I'll just share a story, because I think this is right, that this was, one of the conflicts that came to me was there was a father in a family, and he decided he was going to kind of write his life history. This was just recently. And as part of his life history, he decided he was going to delve into all of his religious, socio-political beliefs as well at the end as sort of a thing that he was going to send all of his kids. Deeply, deeply conservative man, and sort of laid it all out. When some of his kids who were much more liberal or progressive got it, they flipped out. Like, why is dad writing this? Like, why couldn't he just stay to his history? He's brainwashed. All he does is watch Fox News all day. It was just going off. And the response was, one of his daughters calls him and begins just laying into him. You're sexist, you're racist, all of these different things. And it creates this actual schism in the family. Right. And both sides feeling deeply hurt by what had happened, and both sides feeling deeply right.
And I'm willing to bet that 95% of anybody that's listening to this right now has either experienced this personally or seen it in their own family or in the family of somebody they know. This exact scenario in some way, right? Whether it's a hateful message or whatever. So anyways, it's so relevant. Keep going.
And the dad was like, what happened? I'm just telling my story. I'm just talking about my beliefs. And by the way, I raised my children under these beliefs. Like, I'm so shocked and surprised. Like, what happened to my children? My children have been brainwashed, and then you talk to some of the children and they're like, what happened to my dad? My dad was this great. This isn't how he raised us. This isn't how he was, and now, all of these different things. And then feeling like I have to say, and this is the other interesting thing, I have to stand up for what I believe. I have to say this. I have to share my social, religious, and moral beliefs with my children. It's my duty as my father to share it with him. I have to stand up to dad and teach him what I've learned about anti-racism, right? And what I've read recently in the newest book, I have to share that with dad because dad just doesn't get it and doesn't understand. And he doesn't know he's a racist, and he needs to know he's a racist and needs to, sort of knowledge. And there's something a moral imperative within me to do it. Right. As a mediator, I step back and look at this stuff and say, look, this isn't that different than any other sort of conflict that sort of sits out there right now. Right. Both sides believe that they're right. Both sides believe that the other person needs to change. Both sides believe that by telling the other person they need to change and how bad they are, that they're somehow going to shame them or convince them into changing. And when that doesn't work, I'm going to blame the other person for being so stubborn and stuck in their ways or brainwashed or whatever it is, that they don't change. And I can sort of walk away claiming victory. And so look, that's not that different of a pattern, to be honest. Right. It's just that the stakes are really high. I think for so many people right now, the stakes feel really, really high right now. What concerns me deeply as a mediator for a minute is that I've seen this dance before. I've worked in Northern Ireland. I've worked in South Africa. I've worked in the Middle East. I've seen where this dance leads. It leads to a not good place. And when we as neighbors, as family members, can no longer see the humanity of each other anymore, when we get to the point that our political beliefs become more important than our relationships, we are on a path, not to be an alarmist, but ultimately ends in civil war, that ends in death, that ends in violence for people. And while people say, oh, it can't happen here, I think all this, the signs that it very well could are there. We may not want to see it and we want to avoid it, but it's there. And so how do we stop us from becoming the next Northern Ireland, right? Or the next, South Africa? And the answer to me always goes back to, let's think about what's really going on here in this conflict. And I just want to use this example for a minute. And I understand that maybe that not every example is the same one as this. But, if I were to be able to pull the daughter aside for a minute and ask her, what do you think your father's intentions were when he sent that to you? Really, what do you think? Oh, well, dad's racist, sexist. He thinks I'm a bad person or whatever. Okay. That's the assumption from in the box, right? That Joss says, right? Out of the box. Why might dad do that? Why might you share beliefs that are important to you? Because I care about other people, because they're important to me, because they've been motivators in my life. They've been helpful to me in certain ways. And because I care about you, I'm sharing these beliefs with you, right? One of the things I can say is when someone is sharing their belief with me, they're sharing something that's important to them. They're sharing something that has been helpful or useful in their life. Part of showing respect and seeing someone as a person is that I take the time to listen. Yeah. There's nothing dangerous about listening. I don't have to agree with that belief. I don't have to act on that belief. I don't have to tell the other person you're right, but there's nothing dangerous in listening. Right. And trying to understand and ask a lot of why questions, with the people that are asking that, to understand, why did you come to that belief? What were the things that happened? This dad, by the way, grew up not in the United States, grew up in Europe and grew up during World War II. And because of some of his experiences as a young person in World War II, his worldview got created a particular way. He fled to the United States, as a refugee, and had all of these sort of life experiences that were coming on. And as we got deeper into the mediation with his family, the answer with the kids was, well, I guess I kind of knew that, but I didn't actually know all those stories about dad. I didn't see the connection before about why dad might be there. Let me tell you another one on the other side that was so fascinating to me. One of the kids said, why does dad keep sending me news articles and forwarding me news articles and telling me all this stuff? I just want dad to spend time with me. This was an adult child, by the way. Think about that for a minute, right? These political fissures often are just exposing other fissures in the relationship. What was going on with some of those kids? I've lost my dad. My dad doesn't spend time. My dad doesn't call and ask how I'm doing. My dad doesn't show up and see the grandkids and take us out to ice cream anymore. Every time that dad gets on the phone, dad is telling me what he heard on Fox News right now. Yeah. Right. And, to ask the dad, what do you hear when she says, I wish dad would spend time with me? Well, I thought she hated me. I thought she just was, saying all this stuff. Maybe she's saying, dad, talk about me. Talk about my life, right? Connect with me at that level instead of just telling me what you saw on news or what you saw on Twitter, or what have you. When we get in these polarized situations, that becomes so big in our life that we actually forget the humanity of the people right in front of us. So when we see them, the first thing I want to know is whether you've voted for Biden or Trump. I don't want to know what's going on with your health. Yeah. Or what's going on with your job right now, or what's going on with your kids, or whatever. That rises to a level that I think most of us could actually, if we took a step back, say is probably not the most important thing in our life right now. And so I'm no longer connecting to people at the most human level anymore. I'm connecting at this level. And then the question that begs me that I think is begged out of this is why? Why is that happening? And if we don't understand the social media forces that are there, if you haven't watched Netflix special, The Social Dilemma, I highly recommend it, that there are people that are sowing conflict, that there are people that are actually deliberately trying to create division and what have you. And that through my engagement in social media and a lot of other things, I am unwittingly becoming part of that as well, that I need to get control back and get back to my values and get back to this idea again that I can be right. I think this is the right political policy, the right tax policy, the right immigration policy, the right Supreme Court justice, whatever, and be deeply wrong about my relationship with someone. And at the end of the day, being right on the facts or on politics will never, ever make up for being deeply wrong in the relationship.
That's so helpful. And I hope we can glean from that some specific steps to take, right? When you're sitting on Facebook and you see something, or you get that message from your parent or from the friend or spouse or whatever, right? Because these divisions are just unnecessary. And I think We talked to a social media marketing expert a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about the social dilemma a little bit and the impact. One of the things is that's so interesting for people that they just don't understand, because they don't understand the business side of what the internet's doing in digital marketing and all of this digital advertising and stuff, is that my Facebook feed, if I go through Facebook, I may as well be on a completely different website than my dad, right? Who's older and likes different things and follows different things and engages with different posts. His feed is a different website than mine. And I think it's easy to say, no, I'm on Facebook, you're on Facebook, we're seeing the same thing. And this lack of understanding. And so when you watch that social dilemma, right, you start to see that there's not only, it's not like this is a subtle effort. It is very complicated and very intentional and very specific in the way that people are being targeted and the content that they're seeing and the divisions that occur as a result. And it's easy to then draw conclusions from that, right? If you're a 70-year-old who's on Facebook scrolling through, you think, oh yeah, everybody's seeing this. And then you bring it to the world and people are like, whoa. I don't see that. I don't understand that. It's different. And it just causes, it's just a breeding ground for more and more conflict. And it's tricky. I hope.
And that's a very tough one when somebody gets misinformation.
Yeah.
Right. And again, how do I respond to that? And the one way I can tell you that isn't helpful that the person is saying you're being brainwashed or the information that you have is wrong. It doesn't work that way. If I were to tell you that to Corey, you'd say, I'm educated enough to know that I think my sources are right. But if I were to talk to your dad, he would probably feel the same way, whether that's true or not true. And so, part of conflict is understanding that people's reality, whether it's empirically right or wrong, is their reality. It is their truth. I'm in the moment. And that when I treat people with respect of what the truth that they hold is their truth, and how do I help them see the humanity of other people, that's a different endeavor than telling them that they're wrong. And I think that a lot of the work in Dangerous Love is about how to go about creating space for us to see each other's humanity again, and seeing this very unhelpful way that we go about it, which is telling people you don't see my humanity and therefore you're an awful human being, right? Is not the way, is just not the way forward. And it was so interesting. The father wrote in that thing that he sent his kids, he wrote a disclaimer. He said something like, I just want to say that, I recognize that these are my beliefs and not yours and whatever. But again, this is about me, he said. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, he got so much of that right, and he got one word wrong. And I think it's the word that gets all of this wrong. This is not about me. This is about us. And this country is not about me. It's about us. And this community is not about me. It's about us. And this family is not about me. It's about us. And we thrive as a community, as a country, as a family, when we recognize that there's differences, when we see that there's needs that might not all be the same, and we roll up our sleeves together to try to find solutions to those problems. And we die as a family and as a community, as in a country, when we say my needs are the only needs that matter. My needs are the only ones that are important. Your needs are wrong or not what they should be. And so I'm only going to pursue strategies that meet my needs. And, cry yourself a river if that's not the way it is. I have the power. I have the majority. I have the ability to get this done. Our country actually was founded in our Constitution under this idea of compromise and under this idea of that there's going to be multiple factions and we're going to try to work together. And we seem to have lost that in our political polarization anymore. And we seem to feel like, if Biden wins, we're going to go do all of this stuff and we're going to make America great again. But there's 50% of the country that absolutely doesn't want to see America go that direction. Or if Trump wins, he's going to make America great again. He's going to do all this stuff. And there's 50% of the country that's going to feel left out. Yeah. And this polarization is going to go on and on. And who has the courage to say, I don't really like your ideas very much, but I recognize that you're part of my community or part of my family, and that I need to understand where those ideas come from. And I need to understand, is there a way that we can find common ground together to find solutions that are both going to work for me, because I feel like me and my community matter as well, and that are going to work for you. And I think this is eminently doable. It's absolutely possible to govern this way, to live this way in our country, in our communities, in our families. But we have got to drop this idea that this is all about me, because it just can't be. to have healthy relationships. Relationships can't be one-sided. And a country is a relationship, and a community is a relationship, and a family is a relationship. It can't just be one-sided.
When talking about all of this, right, and a lot of these issues and a lot of these concerns, which again, you talk about putting gas on the fire, like social media and the internet is what has really done that. Because we say like, well, we've been in this place before, we've always had political unrest, we've always had disagreements. But when you throw in technology and the rapid rate that technology is cutting down time and space and the way that we get information and how we engage with it, it's tricky. And I do agree. And I want to, and I do have hope that we're going to figure this out, because we figured out a lot of things. Where do you see the hope in all of this? And maybe how does, Dangerous Love and kind of all of the work that you've done to put that together tie in here?
Yeah. I start the book in chapter 1 with this woman, Miriam, who, and I deliberately start this way. Her first quote in the book is, "But what if he's an evil man?" It starts there, because that's the pushback, right? Well, you don't know Democrats the way I do, or you don't know Republicans the way I do, or you don't know my father-in-law the way that I do, or you don't know my boss the way that I do. And maybe this works for lots of people, but it won't work for them. And it won't work in this specific context. And my experience is that people are almost always wrong, right? That it will work if I put in the work to do the work. It will work. But one of the most self-defeating prophecies that I can possibly have is it won't work, so I won't even try. I know turning first, they'll never turn back. I know if I see them as a person, they'll always continue to see me as an object. So why even try to see them as a person? Because I know it's going to fail. And so I don't try in the first place. And I sit and just keep pointing the finger at everybody else. And so when I've watched thousands of people turn, and when they've turned, does it work every time? I'm sorry to say the answer is no. It doesn't work every time. But when people don't turn, it never works. And so, if I could tell you your odds are going to go from a 0% chance that it works to a 70% chance that it works, are you really going to tell me, well, you just told me there's a 30% chance that it won't work, so I'm not going to try it. And I'm just going to go with the 0. Right? Like, we understand logically that doesn't make any sense, but that's often the sort of narrative that is there. And so as you give people tools and hope that they can the answer is that it works. And so why do I have hope, for America? Look, there's times that I worry that maybe we're too far, and that maybe, we've gotten there. And so I think the hope has to start individually. And so, my message to every listener, every reader of the book is quit worrying for a minute about what your neighbor's doing or what your local political leader is doing. What are we doing? What are we doing today? Right? And if we could just do that, we start creating really incredible space, right, for this to open up. And I'm going to also just add, like, it's really hard. I've been attacked by family members, by friends, by former students, by faculty members, everything else where they say this about me: Chad, get off the fence, right? You seem to be like trying to bring people together. It's time to take a side, right? And we know that you have values. We know that you have morals. Just take a side. And the pressure is really strong. I used to respect you so much, Chad, but because you're not out there making the stand that I'm making right now, I just don't know that I can respect you anymore. And you're talking to me about working with the other side, working with the enemy, working with this evil group or evil people right now. What's happened to you? And, my response to that is, what's happened to me is I've seen what happens in communities and countries where there aren't people that are trying to bring people together. When there aren't people that are trying to advocate not for a particular fact or principle, but for the larger principle of that we're in this together, that this is about us, and how do we work together? And if I can share one story, I don't think I've actually ever, shared this on a podcast or in a book before, that maybe can help. I've worked in the Middle East for a really long time, and I've seen a lot of bad things, and I've become really close with a lot of Palestinians and a lot of Israelis. And I've seen some really, really horrific and horrible things that at times have made me want to jump onto a side, that have infuriated me at times and frustrated me because it's happening to people that I actually care about. And one day, as we were in the West Bank and we were leaving the West Bank to go back into Jerusalem, and I was with one of my Palestinian partners in this, we were stopped at a checkpoint. And despite the fact that this man is a peaceful man who was working on conflict resolution and everything else, the Israeli soldiers at the checkpoint asked him to get out of the car. And as they were asking him to get out of the car, things were getting tense. And it looked like I'm sitting in the thing, and they're not messing with me because I'm an American. And, they could care less, right? It looks like they're going to take him away. And I sort of recognize at that point, if they take him away, I'm sorry, the news is bad. We might not actually see this guy again. We don't know what is going to happen to this guy. And so I do something crazy. I get out of the car and I grab him. I start trying to pull him to the car. Guns are drawn. People are like pointing at me, like everything's tense in the moment. I'm putting my arms around him. I'm like, no, you don't understand. This is a good guy. This is a good guy. You can't take him. And there's a standoff for just, what seemed like probably 4 hours to me. It was probably, 30 seconds to a minute before everybody's like, okay, you can go. And as we're driving home, and my heart's beating on my chest, and I'm sure his is as well, his reaction catches me by surprise. He looks at me and he says, "I don't get you." And the voice is one of anger at me. And I'm like shocked. I'm like, I thought he was going to say, thank you for doing that. Well, he was angry at me. And I'm really confused. And he's like, "I don't get you." I'm like, "What do you get?" And he's like, "You have seen this happen to us over and over and over again," which is true. "When are you going to take an effing side?" He said, "We have this relationship. You know what could have happened to me there? When are you going to join this cause, right? To liberate Palestine." And I could tell that he was disgusted with me because he knew that's probably wasn't going to happen. And as I sat there, everything in my body wanted to jump onto his side and say, "I see it. This relationship's really important to me. If that's how you really feel about me, I'm going to do more or whatever." And I had to tamp all of that down, right? All of those emotions down for a little bit. And I took a deep breath. We were silent in the car for about 15 minutes before he said, "Look, I just got to be honest with you. I can't do that because I love you." He's like, "What are you talking about? If you love me?" No. Like, here's the thing. There's plenty of people that are on your side, and there's plenty of people that are on their side. Who are the people in the middle right now trying to help you see each other's side so that we can come up with a solution that actually is going to lead to the peace that I know that you want and that your family wants. And everybody else, because I love you that I'm not going to take a side. But don't misunderstand that. Because I'm not taking your side doesn't mean that I'm not taking a side. The side that I'm taking is for peace. The side that I'm taking is for seeing each other as people. The side that I'm taking is for collaborative problem solving. I'm actually deeply entrenched in values, and these values, they're just not the ones that I think that you want to hear right now in this moment. And that's cool. You have every right to not want to hear it. But for a long-term solution to the problem that you just saw today, those are going to be the things that are ultimately going to have to happen. We're going to have to change the way that we see each other. We're going to have to practice inside-outside transformation. We're going to have to take responsibility for the things that we're doing and contributing to the conflict and turn first. And we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and find solutions to problems that work for both of us, which requires me engaging the other side and seeing their humanity and listening and being curious. That's the way that gets you to where you really want to go. And because I love you, I want to help you get there. And so, for anybody that's, feeling that pressure right now of, I need to take a side because it's the right thing to do in a conflict, think deeper about what values are really your values, right? And what really is there. And is there a way that what I'm doing is I'm taking all the sides and I'm trying to find a way to help us live together and see each other and connect with each other in ways that we're struggling to right now. The world needs more peace builders. The world needs more peacemakers in our families and our communities in the world. And my book was just a way to try to help give us a path to get there, both in our personal relationships and our communities. And I believe we're eminently capable of doing it. There's so many great, amazing people in this country and in our communities in the world. And we just have to take a different side.
Well, Chad, we appreciate the time. I know we went over, and I appreciate you being willing to do so. I feel like we might be reaching out again to talk to you again, because we didn't even scratch the surface, man. There's a lot more. I really wanted to talk about sportstalk.com that started in 1996, sold to ESPN in 2001. I'm fascinated by that. I remember hearing about you and learning about you, and then hearing that you were, and I recognized your name, and I'm like, wait, that sounds familiar. And then I looked, I'm like, oh yeah, this is like the NBA draft bracketology guy at ESPN. Yeah, I've read his stuff before. So the whole nother conversation we'll have to have some time, but the website is dangerouslovebook.com. The book is Dangerous Love. I think, again, we've scratched the surface, but I look forward to diving in to that and continuing to learn more. And Chad, we really appreciate the time, man. This has been an absolute pleasure for us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, Corey and Josh.
Okay. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much, man. See ya.
Thanks, guys. All right. Bye-bye.
Hello, it's Corey here, and I just want to thank you so much for listening into the Hope Strategy Podcast. I hope you're enjoying it as much as we are enjoying having these amazing conversations with these incredible individuals talking about hope. We'd love it if you wouldn't mind liking, subscribing, and leaving us a review on iTunes or Spotify or anywhere that you listen to your podcasts, and share it with anybody you feel that can benefit from these messages of hope. Thank you so much for listening to the Hope Strategy Podcast.